Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Michael Sandler, your host on Inspire Nation. If you've ever wanted to transform your life by transforming your mind, then do we have the One Simple Idea show for you. Today I'll be talking with MITCH HOROWITZ, a leader in the New Thought movement, PEN Award-winning historian, the author of The Miracle Club and the Napoleon Hill Success Course series, which includes the miracle of a definite chief aim and one simple idea. And that's just what I want to talk with him about today, about how thoughts are causative and how to reprogram your mind. That, plus we'll talk about Bruce Lee, Shanghai and the Chopping Block, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Sam Smiles, Emile Cuoue, the men who stare at goats, what on earth is the Nancy School, and what in the world Buddhist punk hell has to do with anything. So welcome back to the show, Mitch. Are you ready to shine?
I am delighted to be here. Greetings from hot and muggy New York City in the middle of July.
Awesome. And that can be steamy, to say the least.
Incredibly so. It is hot here on the Lower East Side.
Yeah. Let's go from the Lower East Side. And before we dive right into things, can you tell us what happened when you published your book in China?
Oh, for sure. I learned from my publisher, Crown, that a Chinese publisher in Shanghai bought rights to my book, One Simple Idea, and was translating it into Mandarin. And naturally, I was thrilled. And I started working with a really talented, wonderful translator living in Shanghai. And she was doing yeoman's work on the book. And we would have Skype sessions together where sometimes we would talk about different spiritual concepts, because folks who grew up in China obviously come into the world with a different vocabulary and set of cultural reference points than we do in the West. And more so, we in the West tend to think we have a pretty good working definition of Buddhism or certain philosophies that emerged from the East. And sometimes our understanding as Westerners of Buddhist philosophy may be very different from the understanding of people who grew up either in or adjacent to Buddhist cultures and places where the philosophy grew historically and geographically. So we had an interesting and fertile exchange, and everything was going like gangbusters until it reached publication time, and they had to submit the manuscript to the government censors, not to Publishers Weekly, not to the Washington Post Book World, but to the government censors, who review almost everything that gets published within mainland China. And the government censors came back and said, well, we want you to cut about 30% of the book. So about 30% of my book, One Simple Idea, was cut, including an introduction that I had published, especially for the Chinese edition, in which I wanted to expose Chinese readers to certain ideas about American metaphysics, talk about how some of our metaphysical ideas here in the West comport or seem to comport with Taoism, Confucianism, Buddhism, and how there are differences between how the Western and Eastern reader may view some of these philosophies and different touchstones and points of view, all of which is quite natural. And I was really looking forward to commencing this East-West dialogue until the Chinese government got involved. And the fact is, Chinese government censors are very suspicious of any kind of non-materialistic thought. Their point of view is that the baseline Marxist philosophy under which they see China as functioning is a materialist philosophy, and frictions in society or the search in life are class-based, are economic-based, maybe have to do with different historical epochs running up against one another. But the idea that the individual has both a physical life and an extra-physical life is very threatening to Chinese government ideology, because they don't want to see there being any alternative pull or alternative allegiance drawing the individual towards something that there can be no government or commercial control over. And by definition, the spiritual or the extra-physical, however you want to view it, is something that no one can control. It's every individual's birthright. It's the ultimate freedom in a certain sense. And that runs afoul of the instincts of government censors in China. Hence, if you speak English, if you read English, if you live in a place in the world where you can get a copy of One Simple Idea, you can read the whole thing. But in China, you can only read about 70% of it. And the introduction, which I was really looking forward to bringing to Chinese readers, was cut. And I recently posted that introduction on Medium. So if you're interested, you can read it there in English, of course.
So many ironies to go into here. Maybe
Yeah.
the most interesting thing to me, if I double back around, actually there's several things that are really fascinating, is that I'm rereading the introduction again in my head right now, and what I
Yeah.
realize is the introduction was a reminder. It was a reminder of where they came from. And I can understand that being a little destabilizing, but it's saying, this is your history. This is your
Yes.
birthright.
Yes. Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, animism, ancestor worship, these are things that have profoundly deep roots in the East, much older than any of our spiritual philosophies here in the West. These outlooks have changed the entire world, and the government in that case is keeping the everyday person from accessing these things, understanding these things. They're almost being written out of history in a certain sense.
It's interesting. So let's talk about history. Let's talk about politics from an apolitical standpoint as much as we
Yeah,
can here. This
of course.
idea, thoughts become things, isn't just scary in the East, it's scary in the West. I was watching recently an attack on Marianne Williamson. It was an article that went absolutely viral that was slaying her for basically having an idea of thoughts become things, of causative thought. Why is this so threatening today? And I'm seeing it as a positive. Do you see it that way?
That's a very interesting question. And I'm glad you brought that up because we always tend to see, we as individuals, as human nature, we see the censorious impulse as always existing somewhere else. You know, when I'm speaking at a New Age center or something and somebody introduces me and references the fact that I've been censored in China, everybody applauds as if we would never do that. I would never do that. We support free speech. We support free expression. We're unafraid. But of course, everywhere in corporations, on college campuses, in spiritual centers, you find the censorious impulse, and it exists. There are people who have to resign their jobs every day in government. They might be whistleblowers. They might have a point of view that is reasonable but at odds with the executive branch. From all different walks of life, people have to quit their livelihoods because they are under duress. It might not be institutional censorship, but there are instances in our nation of institutional censorship, whether it has to do with social media, corporations, college campuses, spiritual centers, New Age centers. It goes on all the time. So the first thing we have to do is be very wary of the notion that the bad guy is always someone else. The person with the censorious impulse is always someone else. It's human nature. It's worse in some places than others, but it's something we all need to watch for. I've certainly experienced it. The other point that you raised, which is very important, is why are people threatened by Marianne Williamson's ideas, for example? Why is thought causation threatening to people? And I suspect part of the reason is that we too are a very materialist culture, and people are, in some cases, very worked up, very fearful, very worried that if you are too assertive about the idea of the extra physical, whether it be spiritual, whether it be something to do with ESP, whether it be something to do with psychical abilities, whatever it may be, if you are too emphasizing of the extra physical, some critics get very worried that it's going to fly open this door of irrationality, and suddenly, we will enter this lost in space world in which we're all assuming that time is not linear and thoughts are causative and there's some sort of extra physical communication or reactions that occur between us. I believe all of that is true. None of that keeps me from having four walls and a roof over my head. None of that keeps me from earning my daily bread. None of that drives me into any kind of disastrous distraction. You can only measure delusion in terms of personal conduct. Otherwise, it just becomes this subjective assertion that one ice cream flavor is better than another. The logic becomes no deeper than that. Marianne Williamson has proven to be a very effective person on the world stage, on the national stage. The individual may or may not like her politically, may or may not like her spiritually, but she has composure, she's effective, she speaks respectfully, she's enormously capable of enunciating her ideas under very stressful conditions. Where's the delusion? Where's the danger? What has she unmasked that has proven distracting or disastrous?
Well, you just asked the key question. Where is the danger? And my guess is we're looking at if the individual realizes the power that we all have within us, then the powers that be have to shift. They have lost some of their
Yes.
power. They have to share some of their power, to say the least. And that's very unsettling.
It's enormously unsettling. It is easier to control people when they feel that consumerism and a certain very limited retinue of political or spiritual choices is available to them. It's much more difficult to control people when they tend to think in terms of very open ended possibilities. And yet, what could be greater tonic for the individual who's suffering than to realize that he or she is filled with possibilities? Just the other night, I was watching the final episode of the show Mad Men, to which I've become very belatedly addicted. And there was this deeply touching, wonderful scene that was shot at the Esalen Institute out at Southern California, where a man was in an encounter group and he was breaking down in tears. And he was saying that he's been working at his job for such and such number of years. He's been a householder for such and such number of years. And no one sees him. No one knows he's there. And he broke down in tears. And the protagonist of the show, Don Draper, walked over and embraced him. And I thought to myself, I wish I was in the room with that man. And we've all been in the room with that man. Maybe we've been that man at different times. Because the truth is, although what he's describing may be true, may be accurate, may be difficult, there's suffering involved, he hasn't stopped to consider perhaps the retinue of possibilities that are available to him. He may need to keep his job for economic purposes, but there is a code of behavior and possibility in his life that he alone controls, that he alone controls. It doesn't seem that way. It doesn't seem that way, but that's, I believe, conditioning. And if we start to realize, as I think Williamson is trying to push us towards, that our lives can draw upon a vastly wider retinue of political, spiritual, psychological choices than we realize, we become much more epic. We become larger. We also become more difficult to control.
Woo! I see such a beautiful positive shift coming in the world, Mitch. Let's shift gears from there, and we're going to go from thoughts become causative and why that's so scary to why are so many people afraid of, and I'll put it in quotes, self-help?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. It's related. They feel it's squishy, they feel it's unrealistic, and they also don't want to do it. They don't want to do it. People don't want to be told that if you're engaged in the same habitual behavior or frictions over and over and over, maybe you can do something and become a slightly better person to live with. Maybe you can do something and have habits that are that make you better to be around, or that make you more comfortable within your own skin. I know lots of people here in New York City who will cringe at any mention of self-help. They feel it's squishy, it's fuzzy-headed, it's unrealistic, it's going to make us all into these sheep-like automatons. And of course, they're speaking in the vacuum of experience. They're speaking in the vacuum of experience. They don't see or understand the nobility of the individual who takes even a single step towards self-elevation. And they're also stuck in a kind of subjective mindset. I was alluding to this before. If a critic would look at me and say, wow, Horowitz's ideas are delusory. Horowitz is in a dream world. His head is in the clouds. I would say, prove it. Prove it. Demonstrate that in the nature of my conduct. I'm all kinds of things in the world. I'm a worker. I'm an artist. I do my media. I raise my kids. I have my relationships. I maintain my household. I save for my retirement. Prove it. Where is the delusion in any of that? The only way that you can really measure the impact of a spiritual or ethical philosophy is in conduct. Where else do you find empiricism but conduct? So show me the conduct of the Alcoholics Anonymous member, or of the self-help reader, or of the individual spiritual seeker that falls short. Show me where their conduct falls short. And then we can talk about illusions or delusions. But otherwise, it's just a subjective statement.
And it's interesting because when you talk about conduct, you will talk about in one simple idea, you talk about it in your Medium articles as well, self-help demanding personal excellence, not
It's huge.
optional.
Right, right. It's so demanding. I mean, look, when somebody walks into a 12-step group, they cannot walk out of that place unchanged. They could leave, of course, and their people do it all the time, and that's the individual's choice. But if you stick with a given self-help program, a 12-step program, for example, because that's particularly rigorous, the individual will not remain unchanged. And sometimes I hear derisive phrases like self-help junkies. I like self-help junkies. I'm a self-help junkie. I feel that inspirational literature can be part of one's daily search, daily therapy. I read dozens of self-help and metaphysical books all the time. I'm very interested in new ideas, new possibilities, new ways of framing things. So to me, the self-help junkie is just another word for the determined person. I think it's wonderful.
It's interesting. A lot of the philosophies that we call, I guess, put in quotes, woo-woo today, were actually studied when we look at Harvard, we look at Thoreau, we look at Emerson.
Absolutely.
And so we've forgotten where we came from. But if we want to talk about self-help junkies, we can go all the way back to Benjamin Franklin, can't we?
Oh, absolutely. Benjamin Franklin's earliest tracts and pamphlets, sometimes he wrote them under the aegis of Poor Richard's Almanac, are largely colonial age self-help, early to bed, early to rise, and, various advice that he gave about moderation in habits, keeping one's word, not picking unnecessary arguments with people. They were colonial age Dale Carnegie. It's in the groundwater of our country. Ours has always been, for all its flaws, a self-help nation, and the term itself is attributable to Ralph Waldo Emerson, who coined it back in the 1840s in one of his essays. Emerson used the term self-help several times, and it's a noble term. It's a term with roots that are as deep as some of our best-known writers and ethical tracts in America.
So, and I love the term, and my audience, I love you guys, self-help junkies. I'm a self-help junkie. We're at the top of the
Amen.
charts on iTunes for self-help. But self-help does have a little bit of an image problem. What's the challenge, or what's wrong with self-help today?
Well, we do all get into cultural habits, let's say. And I do think that self-help and the spiritual therapeutic culture, the New Age culture, is in need of some shaking up, especially in terms of its verbiage, its cultural habits, its style of speaking. I think a certain style got solidified in the late 1960s, early 1970s, which Al Franken did a masterful job of lampooning with his Stuart Smalley character on Saturday Night Live. And I like Stuart Smalley, both as a joke and as a figure. I mean, what a lot of people miss is that Franken turned Stuart into a movie, Stuart Saves His Family. And I like the movie Stuart Saves His Family. It doesn't make a lot of best of lists, but I rather like it. But the point of the movie, and I encourage people to watch it, is that Stuart actually does save his family. Stuart in the movie, this funny sort of mawkish sounding guy in the oversized sweater and this lilt to his voice. Stuart is the one honest, earnest, hardworking guy in the movie, and he's surrounded by corrupt people, and he actually does save his family. So, that's the ultimate irony of the satire. However, I do think that we slip into certain modes of being. There's a little bit of a holier than thou language. There's, like anything else, there's a style of talk, a style of being that I think could probably use some shaking up. And I also feel very strongly about this. I do think that the pitfall of the New Age, and when I say New Age, I use that term in a positive way. I apply that term to myself. It simply means therapeutic spirituality. The pitfall is there is a lack of accountability, business acumen, reliability on the New Age. And I think we have to come face to face with this and not run away from that.
Well,
I'd be happy to talk more about that.
Yeah, well, it's fascinating because you said prove it a few minutes ago. You were
Yeah.
saying prove it. And what you're really talking about is one of the challenges that we can have as self-help junkies is we can drink all the Kool-Aid but not take the action. In other words, we become spun and not grounded.
Right. That's a good way of putting it. I think that because New Age culture has correctly and rightly challenged the mainstream culture and said, hey, what you see is not all there is. The 9-to-5 job, the punching the clock, so to speak, is not all there is. There's a larger world. All of that's true and good and right, and I applaud it. But there's always an unintended consequence. And the unintended consequence of that, and this is something I've observed over the course of 3 decades as a writer, seeker, publisher within the New Age world, is that the movement has also served to attract a great many people whose zeal to escape the pressures of outer life has led them to elevate the idea of being laid back or go with the flow at the expense of accountability, reliability, showing up. If you say you're going to show up to set up chairs or to run the camera at a certain event, or if somebody asks you where the bathroom is, you need to be able to respond to that, to function in that world. If you run a New Age center and you make an agreement to pay somebody, you need to follow through. You need to pay them. You need to keep your word. I have noticed, and I say this from a lot of experience within both the New Age and mainstream world and many points in between, that there is a greater than average problem with reliability, accountability, and keeping of one's word within the New Age culture. And we must look at that. We must not run away from that. That's an opportunity.
I'm going to call it the enlightenment dilemma, which is we believe I'm a spiritual being, which I believe we are, having a human existence. Awesome, great. But that we just want to get back to source. We want to get back to floating around in the ethers, forgetting that we came into this meat suit for a very specific reason. We still need to chop wood, carry water, and do our best to help our fellow human being.
Absolutely. And we must never use that belief in a larger world as camouflage for bad practices, bad practices. I personally know of New Age centers and have had skin in the game experience with New Age centers who do not pay their artists or their workshop teachers. They will agree to, and then they will run away when the emails come following up. There are well-known New Age centers right here in New York City, right where I'm sitting, who are notoriously bad about paying on time. And these same places will send you HTML newsletters about green business conferences or enlightenment in business, and yet their practices are no more ethical, no more foursquare than the very things they are criticizing out in the larger world. And they hide behind words like nonprofit. They hide behind words like volunteer. They hide behind words like holistic. And in so doing, they are using those terms not with authenticity, but as camouflage for their own lack of business ethics. And we've all experienced this, and we have to be transparent about it within our culture, or it won't get better.
It's interesting thank you for sharing that. It's interesting that you use the word lack, because when I hear these business practices that you're describing, what I hear is a lack of abundance consciousness. They're not, they have things that they get to address. And this is one of the big challenges in self-help and in spirituality, is somewhere along the line we got lost, and you talk about it with power. We get lost and feel that we're not supposed to be powerful and we're not supposed to be abundant, because that's not very spiritual, for lack of a better term.
Right. And it kind of, and also look, I understand the difficulties of running operations day to day. Everybody is dealing with a world that can be very stressful, but we have to walk the walk. And if we're going to talk about conscious business, we have to start right where we stand. It's immensely more powerful than anything words can bring.
On that note, who's Samuel Smiles? What can we learn from him?
Oh, Samuel Smiles. He was a British reformer, politician, and educator who in 1854 wrote a book called Self-Help. And that book helped to popularize the term self-help. And that was one of the first mass popular books of self-help in the English-speaking world. And as I alluded earlier, Smiles didn't coin the term self-help. He got that term from an essay that he admired, that he professed admiration for, that was written about 10 years earlier by Ralph Waldo Emerson. And Smiles' prescription for self-help is pretty tame by today's standards, but it has to do with self-education, independence of thought, self-sufficiency, reliability, accountability. These are things that we might take for granted, and yet the profundity of such things can be discovered only in their application. When we talk about these things, they sound familiar, they sound ordinary, and yet we don't appreciate their profundity until we actually try to live by them. So one of my projects this summer, we'll say, is saying to people, look, when you hear an idea that sounds overly familiar, whether it's from Samuel Smiles or Marianne Williamson or anybody else, take a second look at that idea, linger over it before you dismiss it, because chances are I'm not living it, or if I am living it, I'm living it very inconsistently. And so a simple principle like don't lie, or a simple principle like always keep your word, those things are simple only in the abstract. It's when you apply them that they put you in front of enormous questions. Because if I try to apply something like that, and I really try, and I find I can't do it, that places me in front of monumental questions about who I am, about my nature, about my psychology, about my relationship, my conduct, apropos of my stated principles. And those are just a few questions. Try it for 24 hours, try it for 1 hour before dismissing it, because profundity is found in application.
It brings up, when we look at, for instance, going back to Marianne here, when we look at people or things under attack, part of the reason that we attack is when, if we turned the mirror on ourselves, we'd realize we're not doing the work ourselves.
Absolutely not doing the work ourselves. And, you know, it's hugely entertaining to reinforce our habitual behavior and to make fun of folk who are doing something very different, which isn't to say that you can't make fun of people. You know, Stephen Colbert told a joke the other night about Marianne and saying, why haven't we thought of healing America using crystals and bee pollen? And it's funny, and I dig it, and I understand it. My challenge, I suppose, to Stephen would be, yeah, you know, make fun of it. There's nothing that can't be made fun of, but maybe you ought to have Marianne on the show too, because that would be one hell of a conversation. So,
and here's one hell of a mind bender. And try these things. That's the whole self-help movement. Try these things yourself. Experiment with them. Grab the crystals. Grab the bee pollen.
And here's the secret. He is. You know, he is. And we all are. We all are. You know, the most ardent materialist is going to an acupuncturist for his or her back pain, is trying a macrobiotic diet because their fiance said, you know, this is going to give you more energy, is meditating because their allopathic physician said, you got high blood pressure, you want to try TM before we go onto meds. They're all doing it. They're all doing it. It's time we just be plain about it. Yeah.
Woohoo! Let's go from there. Let's switch gears. Let's talk about, I want to talk about Emile Cuoue, and more specifically, how are the Beatles influenced by self-help?
Now here's a trip. Emile Cuoue is one of my true heroes. He was a French mind theorist from the early 20th century, and he became famous for his mantra, day by day, in every way, I'm getting better and better. And lots of people made fun of him. He died in 1926 and said, that simplistic little mantra can't change anything. But again, it comes back to what we were just discussing. Profundity is in application. And Kuai had a particular prescription for how to use the mantra. He talked about the importance of using it in the moments before you fall asleep at night, just as you wake up in the morning. These hypnagogic states, these deeply relaxed states, are prime time for self-suggestion. I write about all of this in an article at Medium called "The Man Who Helped the Beatles Discover It Keeps on Getting Better." And the Beatles, particularly McCartney and Lennon, were into Kuai, and they worked references to him in some of their songs, particularly the mantra "Day by Day, It's Getting Better." That formed the basis for the McCartney-Lennon song "It's Getting Better All the Time."
And Stuart Smalley.
And Stuart Smalley. And John Lennon, during his solo career, wrote a wonderful song called "Beautiful Boy," a tribute to his son, in which he used Kuai's mantra. And Kuai has undergone a kind of quiet revolution recently because, and I read about this in the article, some of Kuai's insights about suggestibility and human nature have been affirmed by recent placebo studies conducted at Harvard Medical School. And I spoke briefly with the director of Harvard's program in placebo studies. He knew all about Kuai, and he told me that he and his collaborators had not been thinking of Kuai when they designed some of their experiments, but he felt that some of their findings comported with some of Kuai's own insights. And it's time to take a whole new look at Emile Cuoue. He was really a great figure, and if anybody's interested, I have an article up on Medium about him, and it comes with complete instructions as to how to use his mantra, and I really recommend it.
On that note, let's dive into Emile's history a little bit. What's the Nancy School?
Oh, the Nancy School was a school of an informal school of hypnotists that developed in France in the mid to late 19th century. And the Nancy School was a very interesting school that came to see hypnotism as a therapeutic tool, that you could use hypnotism to help overcome addictions, to help smooth out rough edges of behavior that disrupted relationships or work habits or intimacy. And the Nancy hypnotists were a very interesting group because they probably were the core group that created what we today would call hypnotherapy. Every time somebody goes to a hypnotist to deal with maybe an addiction, smoking, or something else, or uses hypnotism as a way of smoothing out or reprogramming old conditioning habits or unlocking things in the subconscious or dealing with repressed memories or even possibly past life experiences, they're drawing upon the legacy of the Nancy School. France was really, in many regards, the birthplace of mesmerism, the precursor to hypnotism. An occult healer named Franz Anton Mesmer was active in Paris in the late 1770s, and Mesmer had extraordinary insights, was probably in many ways the indirect discoverer of what we today call the subconscious mind. His theories became very influential. What used to be called a mesmeric trance later came to be called a hypnotic trance. And Mesmer's insights got disrupted because he had to flee Paris due to backlash and scandals. And then the French Revolution came along, and then the advent of Napoleon, and people had other things on their mind than the therapeutic uses of hypnosis. But it was post Napoleon that the Nancy School emerged, and they kind of picked up the thread that Mesmer had woven, and they recreated mesmerism into hypnotherapy, hypnosis, and we owe a great deal to them. And that's essentially the thought school from which Emile Cuoue emerged.
Awesome. And I want to dive into kind of an aha moment of Emile Cuoue. But I love, from a self-help, I'll put that in quotes perspective, that Emile signed up for a mail order course in the U.S. on hypnosis. On the mid-1800s, he was signing up for, today, well, not today. It used to be course. You get cassettes, and then it was DVD. Now it's an audio download and stuff. But he was signing up for it 170 years ago.
Yeah, he signed up. That's very right. He signed up for a mail order course in hypnosis that was offered by a hypnosis school in the town of Rochester, New York, in upstate New York State. And so here's this man, Cuoue, working as a druggist, a pharmacist, in northwestern France in the town of Tues. And he gets interested in hypnosis, wants to study it. So what does he do? Writes away to America for a mail order course. That
How did
helped.
he even find that?
Word
No
travels.
internet.
No internet. Word travels. Newspaper clippings. You pick up an American newspaper, and there's an advertisement. You pick up an American magazine, there's an ad. So he finds his way brilliantly to this mail order hypnosis course offered by a house in Rochester, New York. Becomes interested in hypnosis, becomes associated with some of the principal figures in the Nancy school, and he becomes a self-help icon, one of the most influential self-help icons of the modern age.
Now, you mentioned, thank you for sharing, you mentioned that he was a pharmacist and he had kind of an aha moment, which actually leads to a Harvard study, like you say, indirectly many years later.
That's
What
right.
did he discover as he's doling out medicine?
Kuai was working at a pharmacy counter, again in this little town of Tues in northwestern France. And by instinct, he discovered that when he spoke in favor of a certain medication to his patients, they would seem to do better with it. And so if he dispensed a formula to a given patient and spoke in praise of it, he found that that person would seem to report better results than the person who was just given the formula with no information at all. So flash forward well over a century, and researchers at Harvard Medical School's program in placebo studies structure a similar experiment with no nod whatsoever to Kuai. They structure an experiment using an active migraine drug, and they wanted to see whether the placebo effect is also at work with active substances as opposed to inert substances. So rather than just giving people a sugar pill, so to speak, they gave subjects an active, widely acknowledged migraine drug, and they gave them accurate, positive information about the drug. Then there was a control group who received the same drug with no information accompanying it. Sure enough, what they found bore out Kuai's thesis, which is that people who received active, positive information about the drug did better with it. They reported better results. So what this tells us is that what we call the placebo response is ever operative. It's going on all the time. It's affecting how all kinds of substances impact us, whether they are inert substances, so-called, or whether they are active psychopharmacological or psychophysical substances. And it's ever operative. It's happening all the time. We could be triggered by any number of things, including packaging, what we hear from our doctor, what we hear from our friends. This was Kuai's exact insight. And it's funny, I wrote to the principal author of the study who would not get back to me. So then I wrote to Ted Kaptchuk, who's the director of Harvard's program in placebo studies. And I said, this comports exactly with Kuai's insight. Were you guys thinking of him when you structured the study? And he said, we were not. But I know Kuai, and I agree it could comport with his point of view. So it's fascinating to me that you have this guy working in isolation at a pharmacy counter in France in the early 20th century who has an insight that it takes clinical science more than a century to validate. And, of course, his name is nowhere in the study, but that's what I'm here for. So I try.
Emile, he's working for you.
I'm working.
on that note, how would you define conscious autosuggestion?
Conscious autosuggestion is really waking hypnosis. It is using a mantra, an idea, a visualization, a mental picture to reprogram certain thought groups, thought patterns, subconscious assumptions that we have internalized and that in many regards rule our existence. And sometimes at a certain point in our path, we're able to identify a repeat thought, a repeat pattern that perhaps is limiting us. But identifying that and changing it are two very, very different things. What Kuai felt was that you could institute in your own person the same positive effects that he instituted in his pharmacy patients by repeating mantras to yourself at key times of day. And a lot of people miss this about Kuai. It's not just a question of repeating phrases, but he believed, and this has also been validated by neuro research, sleep research, he believed that we enter into a uniquely suggestible frame of mind, really something very much like a hypnotic trance in those few moments before we fall asleep at night and just as we're waking up in the morning. And this is a very valuable state of mind. Sleep researchers today call it hypnagogia. It's very valuable because we are in a dreamlike hypnotic state, but we retain cognition. So we can direct our attention and you can use a mantra.
Let's switch gears and talk about the hypnagogic mind. Why is it so important? Emile Cuoue hit the nail on the head that we say affirmations as we're falling off to sleep.
Yes. Hypnagogia is a state that we all naturally enter 2 times a day, just before we're drifting off to sleep at night and just as we're coming to in the morning. It's an exquisitely, very pleasurable, relaxed state in which the body is immobile. The body may even be slightly paralytic, but we have cognition. We have control over our attention. The mind sort of morphs and bends like the images in a Salvador Dali painting, but we're able to direct our attention. And sleep researchers, psychical researchers, neuroscience researchers have found that this is prime time, in effect, for self-suggestibility because our rational barriers are down. One of the problems with affirmations is if you say, I am confident, you may be running into the rational apparatus of the mind, which tells you, no, you're not confident, you're a nervous wreck. And then the mantra doesn't do you any good. That's why people are always making fun of affirmations, because they seem so neutered, they seem so weak in the face of our actual assumptions or prejudices about ourselves. However, in the state of hypnagogia, it seems that our rational defenses are down. So using a mantra like I am confident can become much stronger, much more potent. It has a more direct path to the processes of the subconscious mind. The rational apparatus is lowered. This is also why these late night hours, these wee morning hours when we hover between sleepfulness and wakefulness can also be times of great anxiety. People who suffer from depression or grief or anxiety will often describe, for example, the wee hours of the morning, the early morning hours, as the most difficult time of day. And I believe it's for the exact same reason. Our rational defenses are down. So something that may be just the size of a little gremlin suddenly seems like the size of a dragon. We worry about things that are going to happen at work the next day, at school the next day. And very often the next day rolls around and we go about our business and we find it wasn't so bad. It was no big deal. But the gremlins of the mind can take on a titanic proportion during the state of hypnagogia. And that can be difficult. But it can also be used by us. It can be used by us because the rational defenses are down. It's prime time for conscious autosuggestion or the use of mantras. Kuai understood that. He had an early instinct for that, and this was later validated by clinical researchers.
Let's see if I can sew this together. That was brilliant. So first off, we're talking about the gremlins in the mind. Like, for instance, I woke up this morning and I felt like, and it's a theme that is in my life ever since childhood. It's in my parents' lives. I think it's in their parents' lives. The idea that I'd messed something up. I woke up from a dream feeling like I'd messed something up. We can actually flip that on its head. You actually,
Absolutely.
It's fascinating that you mentioned, I'm not sure if it was conscious or unconscious, you mentioned Salvador Dali painting, which it does in a hypnagogic state. We can take in the morning, this is what my biggest concern is, and then flip it on its head and feed it back in as a positive affirmation in the hypnagogic state before we sleep, or put ourselves almost back to sleep in the morning and begin to reprogram it.
Yes, exactly. The important thing to remember about this hypnagogic state, these few moments before you fall asleep, these few moments just as you're waking up, is that, again, that aspect of your mind that measures, that evaluates things proportionally is relaxed, is down. That's why you sort of see dream images or can hear ideas, and they seem very real. But you still have cognition. So you can actually use that time of day, which we all enter naturally twice over a 24-hour period. You can use that time of day to introduce mantras or suggestions or affirmations to yourself. It's very powerful.
I want to dive more into that and some of the pioneers in that. But before I do that, there's a concept I have, which is the Shawshank Redemption syndrome. And what that says is that if you are doing affirmations with the conscious mind, it's going to take you 36 years plus with a spoon against a wall or a tiny little,
Yes.
what did he use? A tiny little mineral axe against the wall to dive through the tunnel through to get somewhere. Or
Yes.
you can do these affirmations and similar tools in this hypnagogic state and instead turn the key and walk right through.
Yes. And I would advise doing both. Do both. You can use this hypnagogic state, which I do. I mean, I virtually never go to sleep at night without repeating some sort of affirmation or adopting some sort of visualization. That is a daily practice, and it's all but effortless. And at the same time, you can also use the repetition method. There was a student of Kuai's named Leslie Weatherhead, and he talked about the problem of the rational mind serving almost as kind of a traffic cop who keeps the idealized affirmation from getting past the rational apparatus. He said, look, there's two ways to do it. You can use Kuai's method, or you can just incessantly repeat things like that to yourself. And you know what? Through incessant repetition, sometimes someone will get past the traffic cop. It will happen. But my contention is you can do both. You can do both. Throw everything at it. But understand that you have this very powerful choice, and it's all but effortless. I use it every day.
Awesome. Well, let's talk about some of the science behind it. Let's talk about scientist Charles Hunterton and the Gasfeld experiments.
Yes. Hunterton was a remarkable man. Charles Hunterton was a psychical researcher. I think one of the greatest psychical researchers the 20th century produced. He died very young. He died at about the age of 42 in the mid-1990s. He had suffered from ill health much of his life, but he pioneered with some collaborators an extraordinary group of psychical experiments called the Ganzfeld experiments. Ganzfeld is German for whole field or open field. And what Hunterton discovered was that if you place a person in a state of comfortable sensory deprivation, in other words, you sort of induce this hypnagogic state, you can heighten instances of psychical activity or the anomalous transfer of information. If you place somebody, let's say, in an isolation tank, and you give them white noise earphones, comfortable eye coverings. I've been in one of these Ganzfeld isolation tanks. It's extremely restful. It's extremely otherworldly. It's very, very relaxing. You are seated usually in an easy chair, and from a sensory perspective, you're completely cut off. And it's enormously peaceful. It can almost be a little unsettling at first, but very quickly you settle into a state of intense relaxation. So if you can kind of block out the routine noise that's part of our lives, Hunterton found, there seems to be a spike in instances of the individual displaying anomalous abilities to exchange or transfer information. And what's significant about his experiments is they were subject to a unique degree of scrutiny by one of the primary skeptics of ESP research, a man named Ray Hyman, who's a research psychologist emeritus at the University of Oregon. And shortly before Hunterton's death, Hunterton and Hyman, the psychical researcher and the psychical skeptic, co-authored a paper. And in this paper, Hyman validated the validity of Hunterton's data. He also said that he did not believe in the psychical research thesis, but that the data itself is unpolluted and that it warrants further questioning. There is virtually not a single academic, journalist, or skeptic of psychical research who has read that paper. And they will not read that paper, no matter how many times I cite it, no matter how easy I make it for them, because that paper, apropos of what we were describing earlier, upends an easy conventional orthodoxy. It does not validate the existence of psychical abilities. It validates the data from Charles Hunterton's experiments, which Hunterton hypothesized as being evidence of psychical or telepathic abilities. Hyman rejected that hypothesis, but affirmed that the data was unpolluted and more research was warranted. You see how close we are, how thin the tissue is separating the responsible psychical researcher and the responsible skeptic. They're that close. They have different conclusions, but both agree that further study is warranted. That was a generation ago. It has never been repeated. And we're stuck in this artificial stalemate simply because people want to cleave to flags and banners and slogans and not really study.
It's interesting. Thank you for sharing on that. I completely didn't expect to bring up quantum science today, but
why not?
But why not?
It's a Thursday. All bets are off.
Andy said Mercury's in retrograde, so there you go.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
So quantum mechanics, quantum physics, the observer affects the outcome. That alone says it all. There's something more than meets the eye. Period, done deal.
We live in a much stranger world than what we were educated to understand growing up. And, quantum theorizing, I think, has placed our generation in front of a question that is profound and as deep as Victorians faced with the advent of Darwinism. What is human nature? Who are we? Einstein has already long since demonstrated that time is relative, that somebody moving at or near light speed experiences an effective slowdown of time apropos of us here on Earth. And quantum theorizing has demonstrated that subatomic particles occupy an infinitude of positions and are only localized, collapse from a wave state, so to speak, to a localized state when a sentient observer chooses to take a measurement. These are really big ideas. These are as big as Newtonian physics. These are as big as time-space relativity. These are as big as evolution. These ideas, like it or not, are going to upend our understanding of what it means to be human.
So let's go from there. Let's talk about how we can practice subconscious mind training. And we could do it with day by day in every way. I'm getting better and better.
I think, first of all, we are, and I write about this in the Miracle Club, it's very possible that we are constantly engaged in an act of selection, basically, in terms of our assumptions, our mental pictures, our emotionalized thoughts. Look, most of the time we function as five sensory beings. Let's leave aside the psychical thesis for a moment. Day in and day out, let's say we're functioning with these tools that we're familiar with of the five senses. How are those tools necessarily different from the tools of measurement that the quantum theorist is using in the lab, or for that matter, that the biologist is using in his or her work? They're more coarse, they're less exact, but they are tools of measurement. Biologic, to be sure, but they're tools of measurement. It's entirely possible that amid all this talk of the infinitude of objects, the disruption of the linear model of time, the relativity of space-time, it's entirely possible that in the same way that Emile Cuoue was correct in his instincts about autosuggestion, all of the mind metaphysics pioneers, Neville Goddard, Ernest, Holmes, Florence, Scovel, Shinn, were correct in their instincts, and it's now only 80 or 100 years hence that some of what they said is beginning to get validated. And the individual can relate to that by considering whether his or her own mind, psyche, five senses are instruments of measurement that can select things, that can localize things, that can choose from among an infinitude of possibilities, not just on the motor cognitive scale, but on some much larger scale in which we live. And my wish is for all of us to experiment with that. That's really what the Miracle Club is about.
Beautiful. So if we take day by day in every way, I'm getting better and better. Repeat this as we go to sleep. How much should we do this? Is there a state that we want to be in?
Well, Kuai suggested repeating it 20 times. He felt that was sufficient, and he recommended that to aid you in repeating this mantra 20 times, you should create a string with 20 knots in it. Yeah, all right. And count it off as if you're using a rosary or prayer beads. The reason for that is he didn't want anybody to rouse themselves out of the hypnagogic state, rouse themselves to wakefulness, because they're asking, wait, was that 17 or was that 18? So use your string. Now, you can also create your own mantras. You don't have to use day by day in every way, I'm getting better and better. You can, but you can also create your own mantras. Kuai felt that mantra covered the bases, and he felt that was a good way to begin. So you could experiment with that for a few weeks, see how it goes, and then create your own mantra. But you don't have to do it much. And again, you can very naturally, easily do it twice a day when you're in this state of hypnagogia.
Thank you. And there's another one that I love. If you've got pain or depression, it passes.
Yes, that was another one of Kuei's expressions. So simple. It passes. It passes. And I write about him using that with a man in Chicago. And again, Kuei kept his mantras very simple because he didn't want the mind to be overly aroused. He didn't want to arouse the individual from this state of self-hypnosis, essentially. So he kept everything very simple.
Excellent, excellent. On that note, speaking of simple, where can people go to find One Simple Idea, to find all your books, and to find out more?
Well, One Simple Idea, which is my history of positive thinking, is on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, anywhere books are sold. And that book is really close to my heart. Of all the books I've written, I would say One Simple Idea is my personal favorite. I write in there quite a bit about Emile Cuoue and some of the other figures that we've been talking about. I really get into the nitty-gritty of their careers, but also their ideas, how they came to them, and how they're usable. We're not supposed to play favorites, but on One Simple Idea,
they're all your babies.
All my books, yeah, they're all my babies. But that one has a special place in my heart. Yeah,
very cool. And then will we send people to MITCHHorowitz.com and
MITCHHorowitz.com. I'm on Twitter at Mitch Horowitz. I'm on Facebook, and if people want to know where I'm speaking or what I'm up to, I don't bombard you with emails. In fact, I never keep anybody's emails. I'm terrible with it. There's a marketing director out there somewhere, who's pulling his hair out over me, but that's the way I am. But I do remain active on social media, and I'm super easy to find and to reach. So follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and you'll find out everything I'm up to.
And if I know anything about you, you love getting emails from people and hearing what people are thinking.
That's right. I love when people email me with questions or observations or ideas. I do ask them to remember that, as Shakespeare said, brevity is the soul of wit. There's only so many I can get through, but I do answer everybody who writes to me. And I love hearing, in particular, from Inspired Nation listeners, because I say this to you in private. I don't mind saying it in public. I hear from a lot of people who come into contact with me through a lot of different media, but unfailingly, your viewers and listeners at Inspire Nation ask me the most poignant, determined, intelligent, informed, motivated questions of any that I get. So I always love hearing from your people.
Excellent. And any last words of wisdom before? I've had so much fun. I hope you have time for a little meditation. This has been, I've so enjoyed this conversation today, Mitch.
Oh, likewise. This conversation was terrific. There's nothing that gives me more thrill than to talk about metaphysics in history and in practice. And we've really done both.
Excellent. Any last words of wisdom you want to share with people?
Only words of wisdom are that there are so many more possibilities open to us than what we appreciate. And we condition ourselves, we get conditioned by others to feel that there's only a narrow retinue of openings and possibilities available to us. And this form that we occupy is connected to the infinite, and the possibilities are endless.
Woohoo! Thank you so much, Mitch. Would you have time for a meditation?
Be delighted. Yeah.
Excellent. All right. If you're driving down the road, either park the car, do this when you get home.
Right. Let's just close our eyes and take a few deep breaths together.
Keynote that I'll cut out. Feel free to go as long as you'd like with this.
All right. Ask yourself what it is you really want in life. What is profoundly, profoundly important to you right now? It doesn't matter how you've addressed that question in the past. It doesn't matter how you may address that question in the future. But right now, what is most important to you? Whatever you come to, it's exquisitely private. It requires no one else's approval. It requires no one else's approbation. It requires no one else's scrutiny. So I want you to feel entirely and completely at liberty to be honest with yourself about what you really, truly want in life. And please know that whatever it is you come to, you have tools, you have possibilities, you have means that are much larger and greater than anything we've been conditioned to believe. Your psyche is an instrument of measurement and selection. Measurement and selection. And you have the capacity not just to take in the world as it is, but to begin to select the world as you wish it to be. Your assumptions, your focal points, your mental pictures, your affirmations, your emotionalized thoughts are all tools of selection. And by harnessing these things in a decided way, you will begin to move towards that life you have selected. This progress may be moderate, it may be fast, it may come suddenly, it may come gradually, but it will come because we are beings with the birthright of selection. And I ask you to be open to all kinds of different channels and possibilities through which your selected experience will arrive. Close yourself off to nothing. Be very watchful and be very accepting of how that which you selected will develop, will arrive, will gestate in your life. Know that this is your birthright. It's natural. It's available. And now I ask you to let your mind come back to that which you want to select, to that which you want to experience in life. And let's dwell there for a few moments. Take a few breaths together. And now I'm going to slowly count down to 3 and ask us to open our eyes and come back together. 3, 2, 1. Open your eyes.
Woohoo.
Right.
You've got me in this Zen zone now.
All right.
Thank you so much, Mitch. This has been,
Great as always. Thank you.
as always, phenomenal.
Thank you. Enjoyed it immensely. Always. Thank you.
Awesome, awesome. Got to crank it back up for the finish here. So for everyone out there, this is Michael Sandler saying, be well, have fun, get one simple idea, and begin reprogramming your mind and your life today. And shine bright. Woohoo! You did it again, Mitch.
Loved it. Loved it. Thank you.
I just had an amazing time talking with Mitch Horowitz. To see more videos on how thoughts become things, click here, subscribe below.